The morning I paid off the county was cold enough that the well pump handle stuck to my glove, and I remember thinking that was a strange thing to notice on a day like that. February 4th, 1937, a Thursday. Frost still lay thick and blue in the shadow of the barn at 9 in the morning, though the sun had been up 2 hours. Behind the house, 40 different kinds of glass caught that sun and threw it back in 40 different colors. Amber, where a whiskey bottle-thick pane from the old Junction drugstore sat wedged into the south wall. Pale green, where a shard of bottle glass filled a gap no window sash could cover. And clear in the places where the good stuff, the old stuff, still held from 1911. Inside that glass house, under a foot of banked earth and burlap, sat the only seed potatoes and cabbage starts left alive in Kimball County. I had $11.40 in a coffee can that morning, and by noon I'd have 340 more, counted out in 5s and 1s across the kitchen table, by men who 6 weeks earlier wouldn't have crossed the yard to spit on my grandfather's grave. Otis Rener came first, hat in his hands instead of on his head, which told me more than anything he could have said. Harlan Voss came an hour after him, in his good coat, looking at the cold frames like they'd personally insulted him back in October. I sold to both of them, same price as I sold to everybody. That's a thing I want you to sit with for a second, because it mattered more than the money did. But that's the end of it, and you came here for the whole thing, so let me take you back. Back past that morning, past the freeze that put every root cellar in 3 counties into a hard, dead sleep. Back past the nights I spent puttying glass by lantern light, with fingers too cold to feel the cuts. Back to a September afternoon 4 months before any of that, when I was standing in the bed of a borrowed Ford pickup at the county dump on Route 2, 4 miles from a farm that wasn't doing me any favors, picking through broken glass like a man picking through the bones of something he wasn't sure he could bring back to life. I was 18 years old. My grandfather had been dead 6 months. And most everybody in Kimball County had already decided how my story was going to end. The Ford belonged to a neighbor 2 farms south, a man who traded me the loan of his truck for 2 days' work fixing his hog fence, and I'd told him I needed it to haul scrap. That was true enough. I hadn't told him what kind of scrap. Word travels faster than a boy on foot in a county that size, and I wasn't ready yet to be laughed at before I'd even started. The dump sat in a shallow draw off Route 2, a place where the county hauled what Junction didn't want anymore. Bed springs gone to rust, a burned-out icebox, the collapsed bones of a hardware store that had closed its doors that spring. And glass. More glass than I expected. Panes from a boarding house torn down after the bank took it. Window sash from a schoolhouse that got rebuilt with brick. Shards still holding the ghost shape of a greenhouse somebody in the next county over had given up on before I was born. I stood in that truck bed for the better part of an hour before I touched a single piece, working out in my head what my grandfather would have said about a boy picking through a dump like a crow working a fence-a-row. He wouldn't have said much. He wasn't a man who wasted words on things that were already decided. He'd have handed me gloves and told me to mind the edges. I didn't have gloves that first day. I learned that lesson in blood before noon. A long, thin cut across my left palm from a piece of plate glass I misjudged, and I remember wrapping it in my shirt tail and going right on picking, because I'd already counted 11 usable panes, and I wasn't going to let a cut stop me at 11. By the time the light started going long and orange across the draw, I had 31 pieces of glass laid flat in the truck bed, wrapped in old feed sacks I'd brought for the purpose, ranging from a pane no bigger than a dinner plate to one nearly 3 feet across that I was fairly sure had come out of that boarding house parlor. None of it matched. None of it was whole either. Every piece had some flaw, some crack running partway through it that I told myself I could work around. I drove home in the dark with the truck's one good headlight throwing a crooked beam down the dirt road, glass rattling soft in the sacks behind me, and I did not feel foolish yet. That would come later, once Otis Rener got a look at what I was hauling and decided it was worth saying something about in front of half the men at his feed store counter. That happened on a Thursday, the 17th of September, and by Saturday morning, I was standing at the counter of the feed store with a list of items my grandfather would have bought without thinking twice. Putty, a scoring knife, a coil of picture wire I meant to use for bracing, and Otis Rener was working the register slow, the way he did when he wanted an audience to catch up to him. "Heard you were out at the dump again," he said, not looking up. "Boys tell me you had a truck full of glass. Thought maybe you were fixing to open a window shop." There were 3 men by the stove, and I knew all 3, and I watched them smile the way men smile when they've already decided which side of a joke they're standing on. I didn't answer right off. I set my coins on the counter and let him count them himself. "Building the glass house back," I said. "The one my grandfather put up." "That old thing." He said it like a fact everyone already agreed on. "Wade, I mean this kind. That roof's been down since June. Hail took it clean. You're going to patch a hole that size with dump glass?" He shook his head, slow, like he was doing me some kindness by not laughing outright. "Boy your age ought to be putting his back into something that pays. Not chasing broke glass 4 miles down Route 2 like it's buried treasure." One of the men by the stove said something low I didn't catch, and the second one laughed, and I felt my ears go hot the way they do when you're being talked about instead of talked to. I didn't say anything back. I took my sack of putty and my wire and walked out past the sacks of chicken feed stacked by the door, and I heard Otis say, behind me, loud enough that he meant for me to hear it, "Somebody ought to tell that boy glass don't grow back." I drove home with the truck window down even though the morning had a chill starting to come into it, because I wanted the air on my face instead of my own thinking. I told myself Otis Rener had never laid a hand on a trowel or a putty knife in his life, that he sold seed and feed and opinions in equal measure and charged for all 3. I told myself that. It didn't make the ears cool off any faster. What I did not tell myself, not yet, not for another few weeks, was that the shape of what I was building wasn't something I'd worked out on my own. That the reason I knew to save every odd size, every cracked corner piece, the reason I wasn't just gathering glass, but gathering it a particular way, had nothing to do with me at all, and everything to do with a tin trunk in the tack room I hadn't opened since the funeral. The tack room hadn't been touched since the day of the funeral, and that was on purpose. I'd gone in that October afternoon to find a bridle and come out 10 minutes later without one, having stood in the doorway looking at his coat still hung on the nail, his boots still by the wall where he'd stepped out of them the last time, and I'd shut the door and told myself there wasn't a need to go back in there for a good while. 6 months isn't a good while. It's just the length of time grief takes to get quiet enough that you can stand to be in a small room with it. I went back in on a Tuesday, the 9th of November, because the wind had come up hard from the north the night before and knocked a shutter loose on the north side of the barn, and I needed the ladder that lived behind the old trunk. That's the only reason. I want to be honest about that, because it would be a nicer story if I said I went looking for him, but I didn't. I went looking for a ladder and found a life instead. The trunk was tin, gone soft brown with rust along the seams, and it took some doing to get the latch to give. Inside there wasn't much. A folding rule, a few cigar boxes of nails sorted by size the way he sorted everything, a straight razor gone dull, and under all of it, wrapped in a flour sack like it mattered more than the rest, a notebook bound in leather that had cracked along the spine from being opened and closed 1,000 times. I sat down on the dirt floor of the tack room with that ladder forgotten against the wall and opened it to the first page, and there was his handwriting, small and slanted, dated March 1911, describing a glass house he meant to build behind the house that spring, dimensions, a list of what he'd need, and underneath, in different ink like he'd come back to it later, a note that read, "Glass need not match, only fit close and be doubled where the cold comes hardest." I read that line 3 times before I understood I wasn't looking at an old man's habit. I was looking at instructions. Somewhere in those pages, if I kept turning, was the reason the shape of the beds in my head had felt less like guessing and more like remembering something I'd never actually been told. The tack room had gone dim by the time I turned past the entries from that first spring. The light through the one high window thin and gray. The kind of light that comes an hour before you notice it's leaving. He'd written almost daily that year, short lines mostly. Set 40 panes today, 6 broke in the cutting, save the pieces for the small beds, and I found myself doing arithmetic without meaning to, counting his losses against my own, thinking 40 panes broken in 1911 wasn't so different from the crates I'd hauled back from the dump that had shattered under my own hands before I'd learned to score the glass right instead of praying at it. There was comfort in that, and I didn't examine the comfort too closely, because comfort wasn't something I'd had much practice sitting with since spring. Further in, the entries thinned to a few lines a week, then a few a month. The way a man's writing does when the thing he's building becomes the thing he lives inside rather than the thing he's making. But every so often, the ink changed again, darker, fresher, like he'd come back years later with the same pen, dipped the same careful way, and added to what he'd already written. Under a March page he'd added, in that later hand, dug the pit 2 foot before frost, banked straw round the sides, glass laid double over the north face only. Under a page from what looked like the following winter, held at 28 degrees outside, 41 inside, cabbage starts did not so much as wilt. I read that number twice, 41 inside when it was 28 outside. I didn't know yet what that would mean to me by January, only that it meant something now, sitting there with the cold coming up through the dirt floor into my legs, and Effie's lantern light gone amber outside the tack room door, where she was waiting on me, not saying anything, because she'd learned by then that when I went quiet over something, it usually meant I was chewing on it, not lost in it. Find something, she said, not a question, when I finally came out with the notebook against my chest like it might slip. I don't know yet, I said, which was true and also wasn't, because some part of me already knew the shape of what I was carrying, the way you know the weight of a full bucket before you've set it down. I told her about the pit, the doubled glass, the numbers written in a hand that had come back years later to prove itself right. She didn't say anything for a minute, just looked at the notebook like it was something alive. 41, when it's 28, she said finally. That's not luck. That's a man who tried it more than once. I hadn't thought of it that way, but she was right, and it changed what I was holding from a memory into a plan. We took the notebook into the kitchen because the tack room was too cold to read by, and I laid it open on the oilcloth under the lamp while she put more wood in the stove without being asked. The pages from 1911 were cramped and careful, a young man's hand still deciding how much room his letters deserved. By 1919 the hand had loosened, and by 1928 it had gone almost careless, fast, the writing of someone who trusted what he already knew. I found the pit drawing on a page dated March the 4th, 1924, a cross-section, rough as a fence post, showing a cold frame sunk 2 feet into the ground with a layer of manure and straw packed beneath the soil bed, and above it, penciled sideways in the margin like an afterthought that mattered more than the rest of the page, 2 lines of glass instead of 1, with a gap of air between them, the width of 2 fingers. He drew it twice, she said, turning the book a quarter turn to read the numbers running down the side. Once in 24, once in 31, and the second time the numbers were different, colder nights recorded, and the frame still holding, 28 degrees outside, 41 inside, dated the 9th of February 1931, in ink that had gone brown with age but hadn't blurred. I sat with that for a while. Outside, the wind had picked up enough to worry the shutter on the north window, the same one that always worried in a hard wind, and I found myself listening to it instead of the numbers, because the numbers were asking something of me I hadn't decided yet to give. "You're thinking about the money," Effie said. It wasn't a guess. She'd watched me count nails twice that week before deciding I could spare them. "I'm thinking about the digging," I said, which was closer to true. A frame like that wasn't glass and putty anymore. It was a hole in the ground as deep as my hip, packed and lined and covered before the ground froze solid, and the ground was already 3 weeks into going hard, the way it does in November, and I didn't have 3 weeks of soft dirt left to work with, maybe not even one. She didn't offer to help dig. She just looked at the page a while longer, then at me, and said the thing that stuck with me longer than anything else that night, that he hadn't written it down for himself. Since he already knew it, he'd written it down for whoever came after who wouldn't. I didn't have an answer for that. I closed the notebook, careful of the spine, and went out to the barn to find the spade before I could talk myself into waiting for morning. The ground behind the glass house was still soft enough to break if I hit it before the frost went deeper than a few inches, and I worked by lantern because waiting for daylight felt like a debt I couldn't afford to owe. The spade had been his, the handle worn smooth in a grip shape that wasn't quite my grip, so my hands found new calluses in old wood before the hole was even a foot down. I measured the pit against the notebook's sketch, laid flat on a feed sack beside the lantern so the wind wouldn't take the pages, 3 feet by 6, packed straw at the bottom 8 inches deep, then a layer of manure gone cold and dry from the previous winter, then dirt again, then the frame itself sunk so its glass roof sat only inches above ground level, catching what sun there was without standing tall enough for wind to find purchase against it. By the second hour, my shoulders had stopped arguing with the work and settled into it, the way muscle does when it decides complaining costs more than it earns. The dog lay at the edge of the lantern light, watching the dirt pile grow, and somewhere past midnight, I heard a truck on the county road slow near the mailbox, and then move on, and I didn't look up to see whose it was. I had glass to fit before the ground took its final set, and glass didn't care whose truck that had been. I broke for water twice, and both times found myself reading the page again though I already had it memorized, the way the lines said, layer, then air gap, as if he'd known that a single pane, however thick, would always lose in a fight against a hill country January, but 2 panes with a breath of trapped air between them would hold heat the way a good coat holds it, not by stopping the cold, but by giving it somewhere slower to travel. I understood, working the dirt, that he hadn't been clever so much as patient, and that the two were not the same thing, though people mix them up. Near 3 in the morning, I set the last shovel of packed earth against the north wall of the pit, tamped it with the flat of the spade, and stood back to look at a hole in the ground that would mean nothing to anyone driving past in daylight. Just a low mound behind a half-finished glass house, nothing worth Otis Rener's laugh or Harlan Voss's raised eyebrow. I went inside only long enough to warm my hands at the stove, and when I came back out, the sky had gone that particular gray that isn't morning yet, but has stopped being night, and I still had 40 panes of glass and no frost yet in the ground, and I understood I wasn't going to sleep before I'd fitted at least half of them. By the time the sun cleared the ridge behind the marsh place, I had 6 panes set and puttied, my fingers gone stiff and slow, the way they do when the cold gets into the tendons and stays there no matter how close you hold them to a fire afterward. I worked the putty knife the way my grandfather's notebook said to, not smoothing it flat and pretty the way a glazier in San Antonio might, but leaving a slight ridge on the outer edge so the water would run off, instead of pooling and working its way in come spring rain. It was not fine work. It would never win a ribbon at the county fair. But it held, and I had learned by then that holding was the only compliment that mattered. Effie came around 8, walking the 2 miles from her father's dairy, with a jar of coffee wrapped in a dish towel to keep the heat in, and she stood at the edge of the pit looking down at the buried frame, the way a person looks at something they've been told is important, but can't yet see why. "That's it," she said. "Not a question. That's it." She crouched and put her bare hand flat against the packed earth of the mound, and I watched her wait, the way you wait, to feel a horse's flank move with breath, and after a moment, she looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her before, something between doubt and the beginning of belief. "It's warmer than the ground around it," she said. It ought to be. There's manure and old hay 2 feet under that dirt, packing down and giving off heat as it rots. Same as anybody banks a stove overnight. Your grandfather figured all that. 25 years ago. On paper, in a notebook nobody opened till I did. We worked through the morning without much talk, which suited us both. She had a good eye for matching pane to frame, better than mine some days, turning a piece of amber-tinted glass from what had once been somebody's parlor door this way and that, until it sat square in a gap I'd have forced crooked. By noon we had 11 more set, 17 in all, and the glass house had gone from looking like a broken thing being mourned to looking like a broken thing being mended, which is a different appearance entirely, though the difference is hard to describe to a man who hasn't watched it happen. It was Effie who saw the truck first, coming slow up the section road with a plume of dust behind it that didn't belong to any wind that day, and she straightened up with a pane still in her 2 hands and said, in a voice gone flat and careful, "That's Mr. Rener's truck." I did not stop working the putty knife, but I felt the cold find a new place to sit in me, and it was not the January cold, though January was still a month off and coming, whether the county believed in it or not. The truck came up slow, the way a man drives when he wants you to see him coming and think about it before he arrives, and it stopped at the fence line where the drive met the section road, not pulling in, which I noticed and filed away. Otis Rener got out without hurrying, hitched his trousers, and stood looking at the glass house the way a man looks at a debt he thought he'd never have to collect on. He didn't come through the gate right off. He stood there long enough that Effie set her pane down, careful in the grass, edge first, the way I'd taught her, and came to stand a little behind my shoulder, not saying anything, which from Effie was its own kind of statement. "Tanner boy," he said, which is what he always called me, never Wade, like the name hadn't been earned yet in his mouth. "Heard you had glass going up out here." "Some," I said. He came through the gate then, boots loud on the frozen ruts, and walked the length of the south wall with his hands behind his back, like a man inspecting a fence he was fixing to condemn. He stopped where the amber pane sat and touched the putty at its edge with one thick finger, testing whether it had set, and I watched him do it and said nothing, because there is a kind of talking that happens through silence, when 2 men already know what the other one is thinking, and neither wants to say it first. "This is dump glass," he said finally. "Not a question. Most of it. 40 different kinds, looks like. More than that by now." He straightened up and looked at me directly for the first time since he'd come through the gate, and there was something in his face I hadn't seen from him before, not the countertop smirk he wore when I'd asked about the loan for real pains back in October. Something more careful than that, like a man recalculating a sum he'd thought was already closed. "Elmer Voss come by the store yesterday," he said. "Asked, had I heard anything about frost coming hard this year. Extension office in Junction's been wiring the Weather Bureau in Austin. Says there's a system building up in the Panhandle, colder than anything since '09. He looked past me at the glass house, at the mismatched panes catching the low December light in a dozen different colors, clear and amber, and one pale green square that had come off a broke-down ice house door. "You building this thing to last a freeze, or just to look finished by spring?" "Both," I said, because it was true, and because I had learned by then that saying less to Otis Rener generally served me better than saying more. He nodded slow, like that answer cost him something to accept, and turned back toward his truck without another word about the loan, or the mockery, or any of the things he'd said outside his own store in October in front of half the men in the county. Effie didn't move until his dust had settled back down onto the road. Then she looked at me and said, "He wasn't laughing this time." "No," I said, "he wasn't." We went back to work after that, banking straw against the north wall of the cold frames the way the notebook said, packing it thick as a mattress along the buried edge, where the pit dropped 3 feet into ground that never froze past October. Ellis had drawn it plain enough in 1911, a cross-section with his careful hand, the double glass on top, dead air between the panes, The whole bed sunk low enough that the earth itself did half the work of holding heat through a bad night. I hadn't understood the drawing the first time I read it. Back in September, sitting in the tack room with the tin trunk open on my knees and dust still hanging in the light from the door. I understood it now, the way you understand a thing with your back and your hands instead of your head. By the second week of December, we'd sealed the last of the panes. 41 of them, I'd counted, cut from bottles glass and window glass, and one square that might have come off a hearse, though neither of us said that out loud. Putty gone dry white in the seams, glazier's points holding what the putty didn't. The greenhouse stood the way it hadn't stood since before I was born, and walking into it in the evening was like walking into a held breath, warmer than the yard by 10 degrees at least. The seed potatoes laid out in their beds, and the cabbage starts pale green under glass gone every color glass could go. Effie came most afternoons after her chores at the Marsh place, and we didn't talk much about the bank or Otis Rener or any of it. Just worked, and once in a while she'd hold a pane up to the light and turn it slow, looking at how the amber ones threw color across the dirt floor, like something out of a church window. "Your grandfather ever say why he built it like this?" She asked me once, meaning the pit, the double glass, the whole buried logic of it. "Notebook doesn't say why," I told her, "just says what to do." "Maybe that's enough," she said, and I thought about that a long while after she'd gone home, walking back up the road toward the Marsh Dairy, with her lantern swinging small and yellow in the dark. The extension office in Junction sent word to the co-op board on the 18th of December that the panhandle system Otis had mentioned was still building, still coming, no date fixed yet, but the wire from Austin using words like unprecedented and sustained, which were not words the Weather Bureau used easy. I read the notice twice, standing in the feed store with snow not yet fallen and the whole county still going about its business like any other December, and something in my chest went quiet and still, the way it does right before you know work is coming that won't wait for you to be ready for it. Christmas came and went, quieter than any I could remember, just me and a hen dinner and a card from the Marsh place signed by all 4 of them. Even the littlest boy who couldn't write his own name yet, just an X, and Effie's hand under it saying who it was. I banked the cold frames deeper that week, hauled another 2 feet of straw over the north pit on the 27th, because the barometer had been dropping steady for 3 days, and Ellis's notebook, in the margin of the December 1919 entries, said watch the glass for frost fern before you watch the thermometer. The glass will tell you first. I went out at 5 that morning with a lantern and found fern patterns feathered clean across 4 of the dump panes, delicate as something drawn with a fine pen, and I stood there a long minute, just looking at it, before I went back in for more straw. The wire came through the co-op on the 2nd of January, this one with a date on it, the 8th or 9th, still building, still gathering itself somewhere up in Canada, before it came down through the panhandle and into the hill country, like it had personal business with us. Otis Rener had it posted in the window of the feed store by noon, a mimeographed sheet from the extension office with the words, "Sustained Arctic conditions" typed out plain, and I heard later that half the county came in that afternoon just to read it themselves, like seeing it typed made it more true than hearing it on the radio. I spent the first week of January doing what Ellis's notebook told me to do, and nothing more. Doubled the straw on the pit walls, ran a second course of glass over the cold frames where I had single panes, robbing sash from the old chicken coop to do it, because the notebook said 2 thicknesses of glass with dead air between beat 1 thick pane every time, and I had learned by then not to argue with anything written in that hand. Effie came by on the 6th with a tarpaulin her father wasn't using, and we lashed it over the whole east wall of the glass house as a windbreak, and she asked me if I thought it would be enough, and I said I didn't know, which was true, and she said her father had already lost 2 rows of turnips to a hard frost back in November and hadn't told anyone in town because he didn't want the talk. The 11th of January was a Monday. I remember because I'd meant to go into Junction that morning for coal oil and didn't, because the sky at dawn had a color to it I'd never seen before, a kind of hard, flat white gray, with no depth in it at all, and the chickens wouldn't come out of the coop even for feed, and the thermometer nailed to the porch post read 4 degrees before the sun was even properly up. It stayed at 4 degrees or below for 11 days straight. The county extension agent later put it in writing, 11 consecutive days under freezing, the coldest stretch anyone in Kimball County had record of. And by the 3rd day, the talk in Junction wasn't about glass anymore. It was about root cellars. Otis Rener's own cellar, dug shallow behind the feed store the way most in town were, froze solid on the 4th night, and half the seed potatoes he'd been holding to sell in March went to black mush. The Marsh place lost their cabbage. The Kesslers lost turnips and half a bin of onions. I heard it the way you hear things in a small county, second-hand and then third-hand, until it wasn't news anymore, just weather everyone was living inside of. I banked the cold frames the way the notebook said, straw packed a foot deep over the buried pit, the tarpaulin lashed tight against the wind, and I went out every 4 hours through the night with a lantern to check the thermometer stuck down in the soil, and it never dropped below 38 degrees the whole 11 days. Effie came with me twice in the dark, not saying much, just holding the lantern while I lifted the sash an inch to look, and closing it again before the cold could get in. By the 20th of January, the freeze broke, and by the 1st week of February, the word had gotten around that the Tanner boys' glass house had come through whole. Seed potatoes, cabbage starts, the lot of it, and men who hadn't looked at me twice in the fall started showing up at the gate. Otis Renner came himself, on a Tuesday, hat in his hands in a way I'd never seen him hold it, and asked what I'd take for 40 pounds of seed potatoes. I told him the same price I'd have asked in October, before any of this happened, and he looked at me like he was waiting for the catch, and there wasn't one. Harlan Voss came out from the bank 2 days later, not for potatoes, he didn't grow anything, but to ask, careful, what I meant to do about the taxes. I told him I meant to pay them, and I did, on the 4th of February, $340 counted out at the courthouse window, money that had come out of cabbage starts and seed potatoes, sold at a fair price to people who'd laughed at me hauling glass off a dump 4 months before. I stood in the glass house the week after, sun coming through all those mismatched panes, 40-some different sizes and thicknesses, none of them matching, all of them holding, and I thought about my grandfather's hand on that notebook, writing it down 30 years before I'd need it, not knowing who'd read it or when. If there's a barn on your place nobody's opened in 40 years, or a notebook in a trunk you've never cracked, you might want to look before you decide it's worthless. Tell me in the comments what you found, if you did. And if this is the kind of story you want more of, stay close. There's more where this came from.